Rick, things are okay in the United States. It's the message you keep getting from the administration. The message you get from Chair Powell is the economy is strong. Outside of the United States, though, there are pockets of stress emerging. What do you make of what's happening in EM?
So there are a couple of things. I mean, we talked about earlier about volatility is pretty docile. It's docile in the U.S. because of the growth in the U.S. You've seen some tangible slowdown in China. We don't think it's that pernicious a dynamic, but you've seen tangible slowdown. You've seen slowdown in other parts of the emerging markets. You've certainly seen slowdown in Europe. So the volatility in emerging markets has been pretty profound. I mean, you've got a Fed normalizing, you've got a dollar strength outside of today. The volatility in EM, it's countries that have to finance or countries that have a dynamic that is challenging today. If you have to finance in this marketplace, it's much tougher than during the QE period. And I think we're going to get more rolling crises going forward. You know, when you pump that much liquidity in the system globally, anybody can finance, anybody can refinance. You know, in this environment, gosh, you got to be really careful about who are you financing and how much more do they have to do, because a blanket of liquidity has been taken out.
But what does it say about global markets, Mohamed, that we're having these problems abroad when the ECB hasn't even hiked rates yet? It's talking about a 10 basis point hike potentially back end of next year. The Fed balance sheet has only really just started to wind down in any kind of way, shape or form, and yet we have these problems abroad already.
Yeah, and what's telling you is as global liquidity recedes, and it's going to recede even more, you're going to have massive dispersion in the performance of different market segments. EM is classic. There's a structural imbalance in EM between the dedicated flows and the crossover flows. Another way of putting it is the tourist investors overwhelm the residents. So when liquidity is not an issue, EM overshoots on the way up. When liquidity becomes an issue, you start getting technical dislocation. Now, for an active investor, that is good news. You can pick up cheap assets, but for a passive investor, you get hit by contagion. So what we're also going to see is a world that favors active investment versus passive investment.
And I've heard this quite a few times now, Rick, that late cycle, previously we talk about leverage. We're now spending a lot more time thinking about liquidity. How important is that to you guys?
It's a big deal. I mean, two different forms. One, as the way Mohamed described it, you're draining a lot of liquidity. Not only is the Fed draining liquidity, the Treasury's draining liquidity by issuing so much debt. So you got to be really careful about how you think about liquidity. Liquidity in the markets is something you got to be really careful about. You know, when we think about the asset allocation, we think about assets we want to be in. You know, as a long-term investor, we think about, gosh, a portion of it we want to take real value, and then parts of it we want to be able to manage our convexity. So we spend a lot of time thinking about liquidity in markets. Where can you be tactical? Where can you manage your betas? Where can you manage your convexity? It's a really big deal about efficient portfolio construction, like Mohamed said. You can use different parts of your portfolio effectively. You know, you think about post the Mexican election, you got, you know, all of a sudden the fear people were using Mexico as a hedge, I would argue, using peso as a hedge. That ripped in when all of a sudden you've got the news out, and the news wasn't necessarily more positive, I wouldn't argue that anybody thought, but there are some really interesting tactics. People are trying to hedge their portfolios and use the most liquid instruments, and those are, I would argue, where some of the best opportunities are to get long.